The night was heavy with the weight of unsaid words. In the grand hall, surrounded by glistening chandeliers, her breath caught as the words echoed in her ears. "You're sold," the voice had said, an almost distant coldness in its tone. But the contract, the fine print, how could she have missed it? The groom, the man she was supposed to marry, stood there, a shadow of the person she had once loved. His face twisted with a mix of regret and resolve. "I had no choice," he murmured, but the cold gleam in his eyes betrayed him. She felt like an object, a mere pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Then, the Alpha arrived. His presence was undeniable, his eyes burning into hers, piercing through the facade of politeness. His voice when it came was a soft growl. "I have come to claim you." The tension in the ballroom was thick, the air heavy with a mixture of confusion and anger. The woman stood there, her hands trembling at her side, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. The Alpha's words echoed in her mind. "I have come to claim you." She didn't understand. How could this be happening? Why was this happening? The groom, the man she had once thought she would marry, stood across the room, his face a mask of regret. He didn't seem to know what to do, his body stiff and unmoving. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the apology felt hollow. The woman's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She was sold. To him. To the Alpha. The thought was incomprehensible. But she knew, deep in her bones, that there was no escaping it. No running away. Not anymore. The woman's thoughts were a whirlwind as she tried to process the reality of the situation. She had been sold, and the man who had claimed her wasn't even the man she had been promised to. The Alpha's piercing gaze was fixed on her, unrelenting, as though he were a force of nature she could neither escape nor understand. "You belong to me now," he said, his voice low and steady, a promise more than a command. She wanted to scream, to defy him, to tell him that this wasn't her choice. But the words caught in her throat. The power in his eyes, the weight of his presence, silenced her. She wanted to fight back, to break free, but something about him, the way he moved, the way he stood, told her that she could not. She was his now, and that realization settled over her like a cold blanket. A part of her wanted to run. But another part of her, the part that terrified her the most, was curious. What did this mean? And why did she feel drawn to him? The Alpha took a step closer, his presence consuming her, his movements fluid and measured. "You have no choice," he said, his voice quiet, but the command was there, undeniable. She could feel it in her bones. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen in place. Her world, the life she thought she knew, was unraveling before her eyes. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why me?" The Alpha's lips curved into a small, unreadable smile, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps or pity. "Because you're mine," he replied simply, and it was as if the air had been sucked from the room. She was trapped, bound by an invisible force stronger than anything she had ever known. She had no answers, no escape. All she had was him. And that was the truth that cut deepest of all. The woman's heart raced as the Alpha's words replayed in her mind. "You're mine." He wasn't lying, she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't offering her a choice. He was claiming her, marking her in ways she couldn't yet understand. The pain of betrayal twisted in her chest as she glanced toward the groom, who stood by, his eyes filled with sorrow but his feet rooted firmly in place. He had given her away. She was no longer his. And the realization that she was now at the mercy of the Alpha, this powerful, enigmatic man, settled like a heavy stone in her gut. Her legs felt weak, and her body trembled, but the Alpha's presence steadied her in a way she couldn't quite comprehend. She had no control over this, no voice in the matter. She was his, and there was no turning back. A sense of resignation washed over her as she realized that she was no longer in charge of her fate. The Alpha had claimed her, and she had no choice but to follow. The Alpha's words lingered in the air like smoke, choking her with their weight. "I have come to claim you." Those words echoed in her mind as she tried to grasp the reality of the situation. She was sold. She had no choice, but she did not know this man. Her eyes darted nervously to the groom, whose silence now spoke volumes. He was standing in the corner, eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest. She could feel the cold air creep through her, freezing her from the inside out. The Alpha's presence loomed large, his gaze unwavering as he stepped closer. Every movement he made was like a magnet pulling her in, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't move. She had nowhere to go. "Come with me," he commanded, his voice low but firm. She took a shaky breath, her body betraying her, as she followed him. The room felt like a prison as the woman stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The Alpha's eyes never wavered from hers. "I know this is not what you imagined," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "But you have no choice. You are mine now." His words were like chains, and they seemed to weigh her down further. The woman could barely breathe. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape this nightmare. But where could she go? The world outside felt as if it no longer existed. She glanced around the room, trying to find something to hold on to, but everything was so alien now. The life she had known, the future she had hoped for, it was all gone. The Alpha stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her. "Don't resist, it will only make things harder." His voice was low, yet there was something in it that sent chills down her spine. She could feel the fear in her bones. She wasn't sure how much longer she could fight it. The woman's mind raced as she processed the Alpha's words. She had no choice but to follow, but how could she accept this fate? She had been sold, not just in marriage, but to a stranger, a man who had no idea who she was or what she wanted. Her heart ached, her spirit screamed in rebellion, but her body felt as though it was being dragged along by invisible forces. The Alpha's hand was on her arm, firm yet not unkind. As they moved through the corridor, her thoughts spiraled. She had never felt so alone, so lost. "You're not a prisoner," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I will give you everything you need, everything you want, but you must learn to trust me." Her eyes narrowed. How could she trust someone who had taken everything from her? She wanted to speak, to shout, but the words stuck in her throat. They entered the private study, a room lined with bookshelves and dimly lit by a crackling fire. The woman stood still as the Alpha moved to the desk, his back turned. He seemed to be contemplating something, his broad shoulders tense. She stood there, unsure what to do with herself. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words felt trapped inside her. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "You're not the first to be in this situation." His voice was calm, measured, yet there was an edge to it. "But you are different. I can see it in your eyes. You're stronger than you think." The woman's heart raced as his words cut through her like a knife. "Why me?" she whispered, almost to herself. "Why now?" The Alpha finally turned, his eyes locking with hers. "Because you are destined for more than this, and I will show you what that means." The Alpha's words linger in her mind, but she can't bring herself to believe them. How could she trust a man who had taken everything from her without a second thought? She didn't know who he was, or what he wanted. And yet, there was something in his eyes, a promise of power, of security, that made her hesitate. The room felt colder, the shadows growing longer as the fire in the hearth began to dwindle. She turned away from him, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't want to acknowledge them. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The Alpha moved toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. "Now we begin," he said, his voice firm but almost gentle. "Now you are mine, and together we will change everything." The days had blurred into one another. The woman barely recognized herself in the mirror anymore. She had tried to fight it, to push back against the new life that had been thrust upon her. But the Alpha's presence was like a constant weight on her chest, forcing her to obey without saying a word. She had no voice in this world. He didn't need to speak much, yet his very existence dominated everything. She was supposed to be his, and every gesture from him, every fleeting glance reminded her of that truth. He had kept his word. She was living in luxury, surrounded by wealth and servants, but none of that could fill the emptiness she felt inside. Her thoughts were always clouded by the feeling of being owned, of being reduced to nothing but a possession. She longed for freedom, for control, but it felt more and more like a distant dream, slipping away the longer she stayed. It was during one of those sleepless nights that the realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had been handed everything she ever wanted: wealth, security, power. But at what cost? Her independence, her dignity, her very soul, gone. The Alpha's grip on her tightened, and though she was physically free, emotionally she was a prisoner. He had not touched her, not in that way, but his presence was enough to keep her tethered. She couldn't escape the way he looked at her, the way his eyes saw straight through her, into parts of her she didn't even want to acknowledge. But as much as she hated it, a part of her couldn't deny the pull. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't before. She loathed him for it, yet she couldn't turn away. The emotional battle inside her raged every single day. The tension between them was palpable, stretching to its breaking point. The Alpha never pushed too hard, always leaving just enough space for her to feel like she still had some control. But every time she thought she had gained a bit of independence, he reminded her of who she really was. "You'll never truly be free," he said one night, as she stood in the garden, looking out at the endless horizon. His voice was smooth, almost seductive. "You belong to me, and I won't let you forget that." There was no anger in his voice, no malice, just cold, absolute certainty. She turned to face him, her jaw clenched, fighting the instinct to push him away. He wasn't wrong. She was bound to him, whether she liked it or not. But there had to be something, some way to break free from the invisible chains that bound her. She would find it, or die trying. The days passed like a haze of confusion. The woman began to notice the subtle changes in her, the way her heart beat faster when he was near, the way her thoughts constantly turned to him. She hated it. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but every time she tried, his cold, controlled demeanor only made her feel more helpless. It was as if he had every part of her mapped out, every weakness exposed. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, she couldn't help but ask, "Why me?" His answer was simple, yet it sent chills down her spine. "Because you are the one I need. You don't understand it yet, but you will." His eyes bored into hers, and for the first time she saw something there. A flicker of vulnerability, of truth, hidden beneath the layers of control. Was it possible? Could there be more to this than she thought? The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. The woman had been avoiding the Alpha, retreating to her room whenever possible. But he would always find her. And each time, she felt that same magnetic pull she couldn't escape. She realized now that she had no way of leaving. Her emotions were caught in a web of desire and resentment, each strand pulling her closer to him. One evening, as the storm raged outside, he came to her. She was standing by the window, staring out at the torrential rain, lost in thought. "Why do you fight this?" he asked quietly from behind her. She didn't turn to face him. "Because I don't want to be your prisoner," she whispered. "You are not my prisoner," he replied, his voice soft but full of conviction. "But you are mine, and you always will be." The tension between them had reached its breaking point. The Alpha was always present, his shadow looming over every corner of her life. But now, something in the air had changed. The woman felt it, the shift that neither of them could ignore. He had started to speak more openly, revealing parts of himself he had kept hidden. But it only made her more confused. His coldness was still there, but there were moments when she saw vulnerability in his eyes. He was not a man who let his guard down easily. "You still think you can run from this," he said one night as they stood in the study, the fire crackling in the background. "But you're mine. Whether you like it or not, you are." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but she couldn't. She didn't have the strength to break free. He had already claimed her in ways she didn't fully understand. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew she wasn't finished yet. The next morning, the woman couldn't shake the words the Alpha had spoken. He had been right, in some twisted way. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The walls of the estate felt like they were closing in around her, each room more suffocating than the last. She had once thought she could escape, that she could find a way out. But now, she saw the futility in those thoughts. The Alpha had woven himself into every part of her life, and the idea of leaving felt like an impossible dream. But as the day wore on, she realized something else. Despite the prison she felt trapped in, there was a part of her that no longer wanted to escape. The desire to break free still burned, but now she wasn't sure she was fighting for the right reasons. She was caught between hatred and a growing, unsettling attraction. She didn't know what to do with it. The woman couldn't stand it any longer. The constant tension, the quiet moments where everything seemed to pause before the storm. She needed answers. She needed to understand why the Alpha kept her here, why he was so determined to have her. That night, as they stood in the private garden, she asked him, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of her emotions. "Why did you choose me?" The Alpha didn't answer right away, as if her question had caught him off guard. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't choose you," he said quietly. "You were chosen for me. And now you're here, and you will stay here. I didn't make the rules, but I will follow them." The words stung more than she expected. She had been nothing but a pawn in his game all along. But still, there was something in his tone, something she couldn't quite place. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Days turned into weeks, and the woman's internal struggle only deepened. She had begun to learn more about the Alpha, more than she ever expected. Despite his cold exterior, he was a man burdened by secrets, and the more she observed, the more she saw cracks in his armor. She wanted to hate him, wanted to escape, but each time she tried he was there, watching her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through her. One night, as they walked along the estate grounds, the Alpha spoke again. "You think you know me," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But you don't. I've made sacrifices just like you." The words were raw, almost vulnerable. For a moment, the woman saw a different side of him, one that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. Could it be that he wasn't the villain in this story? Could there be more to him than she had allowed herself to see? The woman woke to the sound of a storm raging outside, its ferocity matching the turmoil inside her. It had been days since their last conversation, and in that time she had felt a shift in her feelings. The Alpha had changed, or perhaps she had. What had once been pure resistance was now tinged with something else, something she didn't want to name. She hated herself for it, for feeling a pull towards him, for the way her heart beat faster whenever he was near. She had been so certain that she would never allow him to have any control over her, but now she wasn't sure anymore. That night, as the storm howled outside, he appeared in her doorway, his figure framed by the flickering candlelight. "We need to talk," he said quietly. His voice was low, but there was something different in it this time, something that made her heart skip a beat. She didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was, it would change everything. The night had arrived, the storm outside intensifying as the woman stood at the edge of the balcony, staring into the dark expanse. She had been waiting for this moment, not knowing how or when it would come, but it was inevitable. The Alpha had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The grip he had on her was suffocating, and she knew it was time to make a choice, fight for her freedom or submit to the life that had been thrust upon her. She could feel his presence behind her, his eyes boring into her as he stepped closer. "You're afraid," he said softly, almost as a statement of fact. "You think you can leave, but you can't." She didn't turn to face him, keeping her gaze fixed ahead. "I'm not afraid of you. she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with determination. I'm afraid of what I've become. For the first time, she understood the full weight of her own power, and the price of her choices. The Alpha's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You think you have control, but you don't. His words held the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly how much power they wielded. The woman turned to face him, her heart pounding. She had spent so long fighting this, trying to convince herself that she was stronger, that she could escape. But in his eyes she saw the truth. He had always been in control. You're right, she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. I've never had control. Her breath caught as she took a step toward him, the distance between them closing. But I'm not giving up yet. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. She wasn't sure what she was expecting from this confrontation, but it was no longer just about escaping. It was about understanding who they both were in this twisted game they had been playing. The silence between them stretched, suffocating and thick with tension. The Alpha didn't move, his gaze never leaving hers, his every breath heavy with the weight of the unspoken. You've always known, he said, his voice low and almost intimate, that you couldn't leave. Not really. The woman's heart raced, but she held her ground. I never believed it until now, she whispered, her voice shaking. She wanted her to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Could she? Every part of her screamed to break free, but another part of her, the part she couldn't deny, wanted to stay. The Alpha stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his eyes searing into her. You think you have a choice, but you don't. You've always belonged to me. The words burned in her chest, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if they were true. She had fought him for so long, but now she wondered, was this who she was meant to be? It was then that the woman realized something that had been building for days, the truth she had been too afraid to see. Her resistance, her fight to break free, was nothing more than a reflection of her fear. Fear of losing control, of surrendering herself to him. She had thought she could remain independent, but the truth was undeniable now. There was no escaping him, not really. Not anymore. The Alpha's hand brushed lightly against her arm, sending a shock of electricity through her. You've been running from yourself, he said quietly. But you've always been mine. You just never knew it. His words felt like a confession, an acknowledgement of something deeper than possession. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The storm outside quieted, and she was left standing there, caught between her desire for freedom and the undeniable connection that tied her to him. In that moment, everything changed. The woman's heart raced, her body tense with the weight of her emotions. She wasn't sure if she was ready to surrender to him, to let go of everything she had fought for. But something inside her had shifted. The Alpha's presence was no longer a threat. It was a call to something deeper, something she couldn't escape. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Alpha's eyes softened, just for a moment, as he stepped closer. Now, he said quietly, we begin again, together. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew one thing. She had no choice but to follow him. It wasn't about submission anymore. It was about understanding her place in this world, in his world. And though she still didn't have all the answers, she knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. The days felt like they were slipping away in a haze, each one blending into the next, yet the weight of everything she had endured remained. The woman stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, the silence in the room, only broken by the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. She had never imagined herself here, living this life, bound to a man she barely understood. Yet somehow there was a pull, something that made her question everything. The Alpha's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. You're mine. The certainty in his voice had unsettled her, making her wonder if she was losing herself, becoming something she never thought she would be. She longed for the clarity she once had, for the strength to decide her own fate. But the truth was, she no longer knew where she stood. Am I trapped? She whispered to the emptiness around her, her heart aching with the question. The woman's internal struggle had reached a boiling point. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. The more she tried to deny it, the more it became impossible to ignore. The alpha had become part of her life, and though she hated it, she couldn't deny the strange sense of belonging she felt with him. She had been fighting for so long, but now, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to feel, she knew deep down that she wasn't fighting him anymore. She was fighting herself. She had started to see him in a new light, not as the man who had taken everything from her, but as someone who in his own twisted way had given her something. She wasn't sure if it was love or something darker, but the emotions were undeniable. "I can't keep running from this," she admitted softly, her voice barely a whisper, as if confessing to herself. "I have to face it." It was then that the alpha appeared, standing silently in the doorway. The woman didn't need to look up to know he was there. His presence was undeniable. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she couldn't quite read. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly, his voice a mix of concern and something else, something that almost sounded like regret. The woman finally met his gaze, her heart racing as she struggled to find the words. She had wanted to escape him, to flee this strange relationship that had bound them together, but now the idea of leaving seemed impossible. "I wasn't avoiding you," she said softly, almost defensively. "I was avoiding myself." The silence that followed hung heavy in the air, both of them unsure of what to say next. They had been through so much, and yet, they were still standing here, in this fragile moment between them. They didn't move for a long time, both of them caught in the web of their unspoken feelings. The alpha finally took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was overwhelming, yet there was a gentleness in his approach that surprised her. He crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her level. "You've always had a choice," he said, his voice low but firm. "You think I control you, but that's not true. You control what happens next." The woman looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" she whispered. He reached out, his hand resting gently on her knee. "You're not a prisoner, not anymore. But you have to stop fighting me, stop fighting yourself." His words were like a revelation, and for the first time she felt the weight of her own power. She wasn't trapped in this situation, not in the way she thought. She could still make her own choices. It was up to her to decide how to move forward. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been fighting this, fighting him, fighting her own emotions, for so long. But now, standing in front of him, feeling the warmth of his hand on her knee, she knew that she had to make a choice. She had the power to decide. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long began to ebb away, replaced by something new, something powerful. She didn't know if she was ready to fully accept what he offered, but she wasn't afraid anymore. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty, but also a strange sense of calm. "But I'm willing to find out." The alpha's eyes softened, and for the first time she saw him not as a captor, but as someone who was, perhaps, as lost as she was. "Then let's begin," he said, his voice filled with something that sounded like hope. Together, they would face whatever came next, no longer as master and servant, but as equals, bound by their choices. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams across the room. The woman woke, her body tangled in the sheets, her mind still clouded with everything that had transpired. The alpha lay beside her, his chest rising and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. For a brief moment, she simply watched him, feeling the weight of their shared silence. So much had changed between them in such a short time, and though the night had brought them closer, it had also left them with more questions than answers. She didn't know what the future held. There were no guarantees in their world. But she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer a passive player in her own life. She was taking control. "What happens now?" she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. The alpha stirred beside her, his voice low and calm. "Now we face it together. Whatever comes next, we do it as one." The days that followed felt like a delicate dance. They shared quiet moments, but the tension was always present, lingering just beneath the surface. The woman moved through the halls of the estate, her footsteps purposeful, but her thoughts were far from clear. She had begun to understand the depth of her feelings for the alpha, but part of her still resisted. It was as if she were standing on the edge of something vast, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. One evening, as they walked together in the garden, the alpha turned to her, his gaze intense yet softer than it had been before. "You're still unsure," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She stopped walking, turning to face him. "I don't know if I'll ever be sure," she admitted. "But I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens, I'll face it." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition of her strength, before he nodded in silence. As the days wore on, the woman found herself coming to terms with the new life she was building, not as a prisoner, but as someone who was choosing to stay. The alpha had given her space, allowing her to make her own decisions, and in turn, she had found strength in her choices. She wasn't sure where their path would lead, but she no longer feared it. One night, as they sat by the fire in the study, the alpha spoke again. "You've changed," he said, his voice gentle but heavy with meaning. "You're not the same woman who came to this place." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I had to change," she said quietly. "I couldn't keep fighting who I was, who we are." The alpha's gaze softened, and he reached for her hand, his touch warm against hers. "And I won't make you fight anymore. You have my word." The promise in his voice was unbreakable, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The moment of truth came one evening when the woman stood before him, her heart racing. She had spent so long doubting, questioning everything, but now, she understood. She wasn't the same person who had first stepped into this world. She had changed, and with that change came a new clarity. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I don't know what our future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." The alpha studied her for a moment, his eyes intense, as if searching for something. Then he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm glad you've finally seen it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This was never about control. It was about understanding that we're stronger together. We always have been." She looked up at him, the realization settling deep within her. She wasn't just his. She was hers too. In the end, the choice had always been hers. The alpha had given her the space, the time, and the understanding she needed. She wasn't a prisoner of this life anymore. She had become its architect, shaping it with each decision she made. And though the future was uncertain, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The man who had once seemed like a force of nature, a shadow looming over her life, was now someone she could stand beside, not in fear, but in partnership. She looked out across the estate, the sun setting in the distance, painting the sky with brilliant hues of orange and pink. "We've come a long way," she whispered. "But we're still here." The alpha stood beside her, his hand gently resting on hers. "And we always will be," he replied, his voice firm but filled with love. In that moment, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and unbreakable.